Hey, fourth grade, Mrs. Bilger here, chatting with you about your science lesson for today. I know last week you did some work with animal adaptations, and we talked briefly about that, and then you had a chance to be creative with Mrs. Reber's science lesson. So today you're going to kind of continue that discussion on animal adaptations. So Mrs. Reber goes through really nicely a slide presentation with some information on animal adaptations, and then you can go through and then complete the science lesson. So enjoy that today. As you're doing your work today and as you're listening to Mrs. Reber, think about how we can kind of connect this to our trout as well. So think about some things that even fish or things that are around the environment, the same environment that a trout would reside in. Think about how some of those adaptations are made. You can also think about some invasive species that we talked about and how those invasive species can really wreak havoc on an environment, which in turn may make animals adapt in different ways because of those invasive species. So think about that today as you're listening to Mrs. Reber's lesson, and enjoy your science lesson and have a great day.
Hi, fourth grade. If you remember back to last week's science lesson, we talked about physical animal adaptations. We talked about different things that the animals have, like different shaped beaks, different kinds of feet, different claws, different fur coverings. We as humans do different things like wearing winter jackets, hats, scarves, whatever in the wintertime because we're trying to adapt to the changes of our seasons. This week, we're going to focus on behavioral adaptations. All living things have some different behavioral adaptations, so we're going to talk about a few of those. So behavioral adaptations allow the animals to respond to life needs. Behavioral adaptations help them to survive the same way the physical adaptations do. If you look at the picture in the center, this is an example of one of those behavioral adaptations. It's a bear in his den and he's hibernating. So hibernation is one example of a behavioral adaptation. So behavioral adaptations are actions that the animals do. We talked about physical adaptations being body structures. So each organism has unique methods of adapting to its environment by means of different actions. So as we go through some of these examples, I want you to think about them. If you've ever seen animals doing these things, or maybe they're even things that you have done. So we can divide behavioral adaptations into two different groups. We've got instinctive adaptations and we have learned adaptations. If you've ever heard that saying, trust your instincts, we say that because those are things that we just automatically do. We know we should do them and we just do it. So they happen naturally and they don't need to be learned. Learned behaviors, those are different things that we have to be taught to do. So instinctive behaviors happen naturally and don't need to be learned. So here's some different examples, like finding shelter. It's a natural instinct of animals to go find shelter when they need it. Methods of gathering and storing food. Think about the squirrels or the little chipmunks that you see running around, and they stuff their cheeks with the acorns and they go gather them and hide them in their trees or wherever they're living because that's an instinct for them. Defending oneself, okay, depending on what kind of animal this is. If they are usually prey to other animals, they might have some different things they do to defend themselves to stay alive. Raising young, all animals have this instinct of just taking care of their babies. If you think about a mother bird, the babies hatch, the babies need to eat, the mother goes and finds food and brings it back to the babies. Hibernating, one we already talked about. And I'm in the way. And migrating. If you think back to our field trip when we went to Middle Creek, we talked about migrating and the snow geese and why there were not so many snow geese when we were there, but they're migrating. So that is definitely an instinctive behavior. The other thing that we talked about was learned behaviors. These are obtained by interacting with the environment and cannot be passed on to the next generation except by teaching. Now, I know you might be looking at that picture of the football players and thinking, what does that have to do with learned behaviors? But think about the game of football for a minute, okay? Even if you don't like it, you've probably watched it a little bit. So learned behaviors, they have to learn how to play that game, okay? They have to learn the different moves, what to expect, what could be coming next, how to anticipate things that are happening. Those are all learned behaviors. Learned behaviors in humans, things like walking, talking. We have to learn those things. Feeding yourself. You are not born knowing those things. You have to be taught. So I challenge you to think about some other learned behaviors that we have as humans. If you compare humans to some other animals, like a baby colt, for example, a baby horse. They're born, and it might take them a little bit, but they get up and they walk. Like, they're born essentially knowing how to do that. So there's a lot of things that humans are born not knowing how to do when you compare it to other animals in the world. So we've talked about 2 different types of adaptations: physical adaptations and behavioral adaptations. Physical adaptations are the body structures, things about their bodies. So here's some examples that we had talked about last week. Camouflage being one of them, being able to blend in with your environment to stay alive. Mimicry, that was the one we talked about with the butterfly, where they mimic other things in the environment. Chemical defenses, those were like the sprays and the venom from like the snake. And body coverings and parts, like those are the different types of feet, the beaks, their fur. And then we talked about behavioral adaptations. So those are the actions an animal does, and they are either instinctive or they are learned. Those are the 2 things. So the next time you read about an animal in the wild, or you see one on television, maybe you're outside, I want you to watch that animal, and I want you to think about what kind of adaptations that specific animal has. See if you can identify that.